We've made it to part 4, the final chapter of a series covering every faction of Warhammer 40k. Part 1 was the Imperium. Part 2 was the Space Marine chapters. Part 3 was Chaos, and now Xenos, the aliens, the outsiders, the faction that has no interest in the Imperium wars, except to exploit them and consume everything in their past, or simply outlast every other civilization in the galaxy. This is the video I've been most excited to make in the whole series, because this is the one where my journey to 40k actually started. I own Necrons as my main army. I own Tyranids before that. I still have my Leagues of Votann. 3 of the 8 Xenos factions I can speak to from personal experience, and the rest, I'll just be upfront about the knowledge. All 8 Xenos faction packs also dropped for 11th edition with 25 brand new detachments across every alien army. So everything we're covering today is bang up to date. So let's get into it. Starting off, we'll get into Necrons, my army. And I'm not going to pretend to be objective here. 65 million years ago, the Necron tier, a mortal race slowly dying from their own star's radiation, deal with ancient star-eating gods called the Votann. They transferred their consciousness into immortal metal bodies. They became the Necrons, undying, unstoppable, and completely without biological frailty that had defined their entire civilization. And then they were betrayed by the Votann, enslaved, and eventually broke free, shattering the Votann into shards and imprisoning them as weapons. Then they went to sleep for 60 million years, and are only now waking up to reclaim the galaxy and overrun by lesser species in their absence. That was one of the best origin stories in all 40k lore. A tragedy about a dying people who gave up their humanity for immortality and paid a price they never understood. On the table, Necrons are durable, and I love how they play. The reanimation protocols, units standing back up after they've killed, is one of the most satisfying mechanics in the game. Your opponent has to fully commit to wiping out a unit or risking it getting back up. Combined with the Votann shards as centerpiece monsters, and the huge versatility of detachments like Awakened Dynasty or Pantheon of Woe, Necrons give you a huge amount of options within a cohesive faction identity. I've run 3 Votann shards, the Void Dragon, Nightbringer, and Deceiver, as the backbone of my competitive list. The Nightbringer in particular is one of my favorite models in the entire game, and made my top 10 list. If you want an army with incredible lore, satisfying mechanics, fantastic models, and competitive viability, Necrons are the real deal. They're best for players who love durable armies, ancient civilization lore, metallic aesthetic, and have versatile playstyle that is also rewarding. They're also one of the easiest armies to paint, so getting into Necrons as a new player is a great starting point. Tyranids. This one I have a bit of a complicated history with. My very first army. I bought into the fantasy of endless hive mind consuming every world it touches, big monsters, relentless swarms, and the galaxy's apex predator in miniature form. And then I played them, and they didn't feel like that. The swarm wasn't relentless enough. The big monsters didn't punch hard enough. I ended up shelving them and moving on. But here's the thing, and I made a whole video about this, so I'll put a link in the description. The new 11th edition Tyranid detachments are directly addressing everything I felt was missing. Ambush Predators gives the Vanguard organisms, Lictors and Neurolictors, some teeth and deep strike across the whole unit. Talons of the Norn Queen makes the big centerpiece Norn models terrifying objective holders. And the Warrior Bioform Onslaught turns the Tyranid warriors into durable battle line units with a 5-up. The Norn Emissary made my top 10 models list. Those things are spectacular on the table. If the idea of an unstoppable hive mind consuming everything in its path appeals to you, 11th might finally be the edition where Tyranids deliver that fantasy completely. They're best for players who love big monster centerpiece, the swarm aesthetic, and the hive mind fantasy of an unstoppable consuming force. They're also an easier army to paint. If you go for the big monster mash, there's less models to actually have to paint, as well as kind of simple concept. You just have like the skin, carapace, and then claws or weapons. So it's pretty straightforward. A great way to get started into the hobby. Orks. And if every other faction on this list takes itself seriously, Orks absolutely do not. And that's the point. Orks are the galaxy's most enthusiastic warriors. They love nothing more than a good fight. They build their technology out of scrap and sheer willpower, and they travel the stars in ramshackle ships, looking for the biggest, loudest, most violent battles they can find. They are simultaneously one of the most dangerous factions in 40k and one of the funniest. A fully painted Ork army on the table is one of the most incredible things you'll ever see. On the table, Orks can be a horde army, built around overwhelming your opponent with bodies and getting into melee as fast as possible. Their signature mechanic, the Wah, gives the whole army a surge of momentum at a key moment in the game. Combined with the new 11th edition melee changes, making close combat more viable across the board, Orks are in an exciting place heading into the new edition. I haven't played Orks personally, but I've played against mech Orks, I've played against war hordes or green tides, and they are so much fun to play against. They're one of my favorite armies to kind of go into because you never fully understand what's happening. Their shooting is laughable but exciting because you get to throw buckets of dice but only hit on 5s and 6s and wound maybe on that. So it is one of the best armies to play against, and definitely one of the ones that I'm absolutely thrilled to play against anytime I get the chance to. If you want an army that prioritizes fun, personality, and chaotic energy over precision and tactics, Orks might be exactly what you're looking for. They're best for players who love the horde armies, melee aggression, and chaotic fun playstyles, and some of the best looking models in the range. And when it comes to painting, they can be both difficult and simple at the same time. There's a horde army, so you have to paint a ton of models. There can be a ton of details on these models, or it can be pretty straightforward and almost look sloppy, and it's as if it was intended because they have that whole scrap identity. So they're both difficult or simple at the same time, so it's all about how you decide to dive into it. Eldari, or as most people just call them, Eldar. The Eldari are one of the oldest races in the galaxy, a civilization so ancient and so powerful that at their peak, they made the Imperium look like a footnote. Then their decadence and excess accidentally created a chaos god, Slaanesh, who consumed most of their souls in an instant and shattered their civilization. What remains are scattered craft worlds, drifting through space. A dying race desperately trying to preserve what little they have left by manipulating every other faction in the galaxy to serve their survival. That background gives Eldari one of the richest and most tragic narratives in the 40k lore. They're not heroic, they're not villainous, they're survivors, doing whatever it takes to keep their race alive, and everyone else is just a piece on their board. On the table, Eldari are highly mobile. Elite army built around positioning and outmaneuvering their opponents rather than brute force. They're fast, they hit hard in the right matchups, and they're incredibly punishing to play against when piloted well. Notably, Eldari only Xenos faction to receive 4 new detachments in 11th edition rather than 3, which tells you Games Workshop has a lot planned for them going forward. If you enjoy precision play, ancient tragic lore, and an army that rewards patience and positioning over aggression, Eldari are worth taking a look at. Also, this game's look at space elves. Eldari are best for players who love elite armies, tactical positioning, rich narrative lore, and a high skill ceiling playstyle. They can be difficult to paint, especially if you look at like the Harlequin checkerboard style, but you don't have to do that. They can be easier if you just take a step back. Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. And if Eldari are tragic survivors, the Drukhari are something else entirely. When Slaanesh was born and consumed that Eldar civilization, a portion of them escaped into the Webway, a network of tunnels between dimensions, and built a city called Kamara. But they couldn't escape their connection to Slaanesh. The only way they survive is by feeding on the pain and suffering of others, raiding across the galaxy to take slaves and harvest their agony. There are pirates, torturers, and raiders who sustain their immortality through cruelty. One of the darkest factions in 40k lore. On the table, Drukhari are a glass cannon army. Incredibly fast, hard-hitting on the charge, but fragile when they get hit back. Everything about their playstyle is built around striking first and never getting caught. They are one of the highest skill ceiling armies in the game because of the margin of error is razor thin. Get your positioning right, and Drukhari dismantle the opponents before they can respond. Get it wrong, and you lose your army fast. This is one of the factions I know the least about on the tabletop, but the model range is stunning. Their lore is compelling in every way, and for players who love that high risk, high reward playstyle, Drukhari are unlike anything else in the Xenos range. They are best for experienced players who love that fast glass cannon army with the high risk, high reward playstyle and dark, sinister aesthetics. They're also difficult to collect thanks to Forge World. There are tons of articles about how to kit bash them and get the most out of each of their packs. So if you get into them, try and look into that beforehand. Tau Empire. And this one has a reputation that precedes it. If you've ever heard someone complaining about being shot off the table before they could do anything, there's a good chance Tau were involved. The Tau are a relatively young race by 40k standards, a rapidly expanding empire built on cooperating between multiple species under the philosophy of the greater good. Where most factions in the game are ancient, corrupted, or dying, the Tau are optimistic, technologically advancing, and believe they can bring order to the galaxy through diplomacy, backed by overwhelming firepower. That makes them unique to the 40k universe. On the table, Tau are the premier shooting army in the game. Battlesuits, pulse weapons, drones, railguns, everything about their playstyle is built around destroying opponents at range before they ever get close. Their signature mechanic, allowing Tau units to support each other's shooting in new ways. In a meta shifting towards melee, Tau players are going to have to think carefully about how they control space and keep opponents at arm's reach. If you want the most technologically advanced army in the Xenos range with a pure shooting identity, Tau are a clear choice. Just be prepared to think hard about board control. They're best for players who love pure shooting armies, the technological or Gundam aesthetic, and a more optimistic faction identity than most in 40k. They can also be pretty straightforward to paint because they have a lot of flat panels. They're great for an airbrush, but bear in mind they are one of the more expensive armies to get into, so careful of that. Gene Stealer cults. And this one is very unique. Gene Stealer cults aren't a traditional military force. They're a hidden rebellion, infested civilians, and workers who have been slowly converted by Tyrannid Gene Stealer organisms, building a cult within an imperial world over generations, waiting for the moment to rise up and tear the planet apart from within right before the Tyrannid fleet arrives to consume it. They are sleeper agents, insurgents, and fanatical true believers who have no idea they're just advanced troops for a consuming alien swarm. That identity makes them one of the most thematically compelling armies in the game, I think. And on the table, it translates into a unique playstyle built around ambush and surprise. Cult units can appear from unexpected locations, units that were destroyed can return from reserve, and the whole army is built around disrupting your opponent's plans rather than meeting them head on. Gene Stealer cults are one of the more complex armies to pilot well, but the payoff for getting it right is spectacular. If you want an army that plays completely different to anything else in the game, and you love the insurgent uprising theme, GSE is worth the investment to learn. They're best for players who love the ambush mechanics, unique playstyles, and complex army rules, and the most surprising faction narrative in 40k. Bear in mind, they are incredibly expensive to collect and even harder to paint. So they're not one I would recommend for new players, but if you really want to get into them, I won't be the one to get in your way. And finally, the Leagues of Votann, the Space Dwarves. The Votann are the most recently released faction in 40k, a stocky, industrious race descended from ancient human colonists who have spent a millennia in the deep void mining resources and building an empire on the edges of the galaxy. They're pragmatic, tough, honor-bound, and they carry a grudge the way most people carry oxygen. Do not wrong a kin of the Leagues unless you want to be hunted across the stars for the next century. And the model range is excellent. Buri Agnerson, who made my top 10 models list, specifically because he incorporated a Tyranid carapace into his armor, is one of the most cleverly designed character models in the game. There's a lot of love in this range. On the table, Votann are a compact, hard-hitting shooting army. Relatively low model count, high-quality units with strong anti-armor capabilities. They're not as elite as Custodes, but they punch above their weight for the points. My honest experience though, the painting nearly broke me. The models are incredibly detailed in ways I didn't appreciate when I bought them. Lots of tiny features, lots of intricate armor panels, lots of areas that are a challenge for a newer painter. I'm not unhappy I own them, but I encourage any newer hobbyist to look carefully at the models before committing, because they're more of a challenge than they might appear. They're best for players who love that dwarven aesthetic, love the shooting armies, and don't mind a painting challenge for a highly detailed and rewarding model range. And that's every Xenos faction in 40k. Necrons, Tyranids, Orks, Eldari, Drukhari, Tau, Genestealer, and Votann. 8 completely different armies with 8 completely different playstyles and identities. And that wraps up this series. Every faction in 40k. Imperium, Space Marine chapters, Chaos, and Xenos. If you've watched all 4 parts, thank you. That's a lot of content to get through, and I hope somewhere in there you found the faction that's calling to you. My personal recommendations: if you're brand new, don't know where to start. Necrons if you want something durable and satisfying to learn on. Space Marines if you want that flexibility and classic look. So, drop a comment and tell me, which faction are you playing? Or which one did this series push you towards? I read every single comment, and I would love to know. This channel is going to keep growing from here. For league games, tournament content, army builds, news coverage, all of it coming as we head into 11th edition properly. Subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next one.